These are 7 cognitive behaviors that separate genuinely sharp minds from the overwhelming majority of people who believe they are sharp. And the difference has nothing to do with IQ, education, or how much you read. Most people move through life with a thinking style built entirely around comfort, sidestepping contradiction, landing on the first conclusion that makes sense, and almost never turning that same critical eye on their own assumptions. That description fits the vast majority of the population, and the uncomfortable part is that most of them would disagree with that assessment. What this video covers is 7 specific mental habits, each one backed by decades of research in cognitive science and psychology, that mark someone whose mind is operating at a genuinely different level, not a morally superior level, not a better person, but a sharper thinker, someone whose cognition is quietly doing something most people around them never do. Some of what you hear will feel like recognition, some of it will be uncomfortable, and that discomfort, as it turns out, is part of the point. The first marker of a genuinely sharp mind is dialectical thinking. You argue with yourself, and you do it on purpose. And before that phrase sends you anywhere, here is exactly what it means in practice. Dialectical thinking is a cognitive style built on 3 beliefs: that reality is always in motion, that opposing forces can exist inside the same thing at the same time, and that everything connects to everything else. What this looks like in a real person is the ability to hold 2 contradictory ideas in your head simultaneously, without needing to immediately force one of them to lose. David Dunning, one of the most cited psychologists in the world on the subject of self-knowledge, studied this at Cornell University and noted that people with sharp minds become their own devil's advocates, challenging themselves to find exactly where they might be wrong. And they do this not because they enjoy doubt, but because they understand that a belief which has never been tested is a belief you do not actually understand. From a brain science angle, researchers studying dialectical thinkers found something that reads as counterintuitive at first, which is that these thinkers show more subdued neural responses to positive emotional stimuli. Most people hear that and assume it means less happiness or excitement, but what the data actually shows is emotional regulation, a brain that is not ricocheting between reactions, a mind that stays level. The cognitive benefits showed up clearly in a study of 445 participants, where those exposed to a dialectical thinking intervention came out with significantly higher intellectual humility scores than control groups, and the mechanism was specific. Dialectical thinking reduced what researchers call dichotomous thinking, the black and white framing that most people default to when things get complicated. Cross-cultural research adds another layer, with studies showing that East Asian thinkers outperform Western thinkers on average in their capacity to embrace contradictions and anticipate change. And this gap traces not to genetics but to a cultural tradition of training the mind to sit with paradox rather than rushing to resolve it. People who regularly argue against their own position, who build out the strongest version of the opposing case before committing to a view, are doing something the majority of people around them never do, and that cognitive habit carries a real social and mental cost every single day. Trait 2. You see where conversations are going, and it exhausts you. Back in the 1970s, psychologists Herbert Simon and William Chase ran a landmark series of studies on chess masters, and their central finding cut against what most people would expect. Chess experts did not possess superior general intelligence or general memory, and their advantage came entirely from the ability to perceive and recall meaningful configurations of chess pieces as organized chunks rather than individual pieces, which meant that when a position appeared on the board, they were not analyzing it from scratch, but recognizing it from a library they had spent years building. That research has since traveled far beyond chess, because the same principle holds across every domain, Mathematics, medicine, business, and classroom teaching all show experts pulling ahead through pattern recognition rather than raw processing speed. Radiologists can fixate on abnormalities in under a second, and in chess studies, novices took 4 times as long as experts to reach a decision, not because they were less intelligent in general, but because they lacked the organized internal library. Bring that into a normal social situation, and here is where it gets draining. Someone with a highly developed pattern library, built through reading, study, lived experience, or deep reflection, will frequently find themselves in conversations where the destination is visible several minutes before the other person arrives there, and social norms offer no clean exit from this. You cannot skip to the end. You have to let people reach their own conclusions in their own time, which requires putting your mind in idle while you wait. The fatigue that comes from that combination, the boredom of waiting fused with the social inability to mentally check out, is a very specific kind of exhaustion that highly pattern-literate people experience constantly, but rarely have a name for. And it has nothing to do with arrogance. It is the pattern recognition machinery running in the background and finding nothing to engage. People who frequently feel understimulated in conversations that others find perfectly satisfying are not suffering from a personality flaw. They are experiencing a neurocognitive reality that the typical social environment was simply not built to accommodate. Trait 3. You can change your mind without losing yourself. And it is also one of the most misread markers of intelligence, because from the outside it looks exactly like weakness. The formal definition is the capacity to shift your thinking and attention between different frameworks in response to changing demands. But in plainer terms, it is the ability to update your model of the world when the evidence shifts, without that update feeling like an attack on who you are. Life outcomes research on this is direct. Individuals with greater cognitive flexibility show improved social functioning and slower cognitive decline with age, along with higher resilience against stress, better quality of life, and greater mindfulness, while the reverse carries an increased risk of depressive and anxiety disorders. What most content on this topic skips over is the dark psychology of why most people resist this, because it is rarely about intelligence and much more about the social cost of changing your mind in public, which signals status loss, reads as weakness, and triggers a deeply wired resistance in brains that evolved to care enormously about standing in the group. Researchers at Cambridge University used fMRI scanning to map exactly what happens neurologically when someone updates a position, and they found greater activation in the inferior frontal junction, anterior insula, anterior cingulate, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, all regions tied to self-control, conflict monitoring, and higher-order reasoning. Using multivariate pattern analysis of that brain activity, they could predict with 77% accuracy whether a participant would change their mind before the person was consciously aware of it themselves. What that tells you is that updating a belief is not passive. It is an active neural process, and the people who do it readily have trained specific systems to override the social threat response, whether they know it or not. The sharpest minds in any room tend to be the ones who shift their stated position most readily when the evidence asks them to. And that is not inconsistency. It is the most sophisticated relationship with truth that is cognitively available to us. Trait 4 is what can be called negative space cognition, the ability to draw real conclusions from what is absent rather than only from what is present. And this capacity, more than almost any other on this list, separates the top tier of analytical thinkers from everyone else. The sharpest illustration of this comes from a Sherlock Holmes story, published in 1892. A short story called Silver Blaze, where Holmes cracks the case not through the evidence that exists, but through a critical absence, a guard dog that never barked during the commission of the crime, from which Holmes concludes that the midnight visitor was someone the dog already knew. making it an inside job. What Arthur Conan Doyle captured in that scene, and what cognitive researchers have since studied formally, is the ability to recognize a meaningful gap, because the less analytically trained mind focuses on the facts that are present and ignores the facts that are missing. This is not a character flaw, it is the natural default mode of human cognition. Our brains are pattern completion machines, and when a partial image appears, the mind fills in what is missing automatically, a Gestalt psychology principle that runs at a level most people never consciously access. The sharper mind catches itself doing that filling in and then questions the process, asking what it would expect to see that it is not seeing. What is conspicuously absent from this argument, this conversation, this person's behavior? Researchers working across fields from medicine to intelligence analysis to high-stakes negotiation describe this observance of absence as one of the clearest dividing lines between experts and novices, because perceiving what is not there is significantly harder than perceiving what is, especially when absence is not expected. Arthur Conan Doyle modeled Sherlock Holmes on a real Scottish surgeon named Dr. Joseph Bell, his mentor at the University of Edinburgh, who built a reputation for deducing detailed information about his patients purely through observation, focusing heavily on what they omitted, how they failed to react, and what their stories conspicuously left out. People whose first instinct when someone makes a case is to scan for what that person is not telling them, are doing something cognitively rare, and they are doing it whether they have a name for it or not. Trait 5. People drain you, even the ones you love. And it needs to be handled carefully here, because it gets misattributed to introversion so often that the actual cognitive explanation almost never gets a fair hearing. In 2016, Satoshi Kanazawa of the London School of Economics and Norman Lee of Singapore Management University published a study drawing on data from over 15,000 adults between the ages of 18 and 28, and their finding was this: more intelligent individuals reported lower life satisfaction with more frequent socialization with friends, not lower satisfaction across the board, but specifically with frequent social contact. The explanation they offered came through what they called the Savannah theory of happiness, built on the observation that the human brain evolved to meet the demands of an ancestral environment where population density resembled rural Alaska, less than one person per square kilometer, where our ancestors lived in bands of roughly 150 individuals, and where frequent contact with close allies was survival critical, which meant the brain evolved to find that contact rewarding. More intelligent people, their argument went, are better equipped to adapt to conditions that have no evolutionary precedent, including extended solitude, without suffering the same drop in satisfaction that the average person experiences when separated from social contact. Beyond the evolutionary framing, there is a more immediate cognitive explanation. Highly intelligent people process social interactions differently, with their brains running pattern recognition, subtext analysis, and intellectual scanning simultaneously throughout every conversation, and in most social settings that machinery runs at full capacity while finding very little to actually work with. There is also what might be called a translation burden, where people operating at high cognitive complexity are constantly converting their internal world into language that will not confuse or alienate the people around them. A process that repeats across every interaction, every single day, and which functions like speaking a second language around the clock. Researcher Colin DeYoung at the University of Minnesota found that extroverts carry a more activated dopamine system than introverts, where dopamine drives approach motivation, reward seeking, and social energy, and this is not a flaw in either direction, but a neurological difference that determines how much social stimulation a person can absorb before hitting saturation, feeling more depleted than energized after most social interactions, even genuinely enjoyable ones, is not a sign of something broken. It is a sign of a brain processing the world at a resolution that most social environments were never designed to match. Trait 6. You are deeply uncomfortable around overconfident people. Trait 6 requires a real look at the Dunning-Kruger effect, and not the version that gets passed around online, which has been simplified to the point of losing the part that matters most. Cornell University psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger published the original research in 1999 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, testing participants on logic, grammar, and sense of humor, then asking each person to rate their own performance. Bottom quartile performers, those who scored at the 12th percentile on average, placed themselves at the 62nd percentile, a gap of 50 percentile points between their actual performance and their self-assessment. Their conclusion was that people with low competence reach erroneous conclusions and make poor choices, but their incompetence simultaneously strips them of the very metacognitive capacity needed to recognize any of this, which they called the double burden. The people who know least about something are the most confident about it and the least capable of seeing their own ignorance. Replicated across business, politics, medicine, aviation, spatial memory, school examinations, and literacy, it stands as one of the most consistent findings in modern psychology. But here is the dimension that almost never gets discussed. The effect runs in reverse for high performers. The same research established that genuinely competent people systematically underestimate their own abilities, assuming that tasks which come easily to them are easy for everyone, which means they consistently underestimate how uncommon their skills actually are. In medical training studies, when top performers watched videotapes of other students, they raised their self-evaluations to align with what their supervisors had already concluded, while bottom performers adjusted not at all. Bertrand Russell captured this in a single sentence in a 1933 essay. "The trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure, and the intelligent are full of doubt," and Charles Darwin made the same observation in 1871 in The Descent of Man, writing that ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. That visceral discomfort around people who are loudly certain about things they clearly do not understand is not arrogance. It is a calibrated cognitive response from a mind that has spent enough time with actual evidence to recognize, almost involuntarily, the gap between confidence and competence. Trait 7 is the darkest one on this list, and in practical terms, it may be the most powerful. You think about your own death, and it makes you clearer. It is time awareness, or what psychologists formally call mortality salience, and the research on what this awareness actually does to human cognition is extraordinary. Cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker published The Denial of Death in 1973, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. His central argument was that most human action is organized around ignoring or avoiding the inevitability of death, and the awareness of annihilation generates such a deep, largely subconscious anxiety that people spend their entire lives constructing systems of meaning, achievement, legacy, and belief, specifically to buffer against it. Building directly on Becker's work, psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pishinsky formalized these ideas in 1986 into what became terror management theory, which has since generated more than 1,500 empirical studies examining how death awareness shapes human behavior across aggression, political preferences, risk-taking, legal judgments, creativity, religion, and health-related decision-making. A meta-analysis covering 164 articles and 277 experiments found that mortality salience produced moderate, consistent effects across a wide range of worldview and self-esteem-related behaviors, with people responding more positively toward those who uphold their cultural values and more negatively toward those who violate them, making more conservative decisions, clinging harder to established worldviews, and showing greater susceptibility to all of this when self-esteem is low, while high self-esteem functions as a buffer. The dark psychology insight here is that the average person avoids thinking about death, and that avoidance carries a real cost. When mortality is never consciously integrated, it runs entirely in the subconscious, quietly shaping decisions, driving status anxiety, fueling impulsive choices, and generating a low background dread that most people spend years misidentifying as something else entirely. The person whose mind operates at a sharper level does something different, bringing mortality into conscious awareness and using it as a strategic filter rather than flinching from it, which is not morbid or paralyzed thinking, but rather a clarifying lens. The question philosophers have returned to for millennia, and that modern neuroscience now supports. There is a real paradox embedded in the research here. When mortality thoughts get triggered reactively, when death feels like an incoming threat rather than a chosen frame, the cognitive effect reverses. People become more rigid, more resistant to new information, and more prone to reject evidence that contradicts their existing worldview, because holding on to familiar beliefs is one of the ways the subconscious alleviates the anxiety that mortality salience generates. But when mortality awareness is integrated deliberately, chosen as a cognitive lens rather than arriving as a threat, the person becomes more measured, less reactive, more willing to update beliefs without existential panic, and more focused on what they have consciously decided actually matters. And that capacity to think clearly about their own death without flinching is a cognitive resource that most people spend their entire lives refusing to touch. 7 traits, and none of them are comfortable to carry. Dialectical thinking, the ability to argue against your own position without losing your footing. Rapid pattern recognition, and the particular social exhaustion it produces. Cognitive flexibility, updating your worldview without treating it as a personal attack. Negative space cognition, scanning for what is missing rather than only what is there. Social depletion from deep processing, a calibrated discomfort with overconfidence. And mortality salience, the capacity to use the awareness of death as a tool for clarity rather than a source of dread. None of these traits make social life easier, and most of them make specific parts of it harder, more isolating, more draining, more quietly frustrating. The person who scores high across all 7 is not necessarily happier in the conventional sense, but they are more accurate, and they are navigating a world where the people around them are operating with a significantly different picture of reality. What the research keeps returning to, from the Dunning-Kruger studies to the work on dialectical cognition, is that the sharpest minds in any room are almost never the most confident ones. They are the ones most aware of the edges of what they know, and most committed to not performing certainty they do not actually have. Bertrand Russell put the whole thing in one sentence back in 1933. The trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. If any part of this video landed as recognition rather than information, if you found yourself in the exhaustion, the pattern recognition, the discomfort with overconfidence, the internal argumentation, then validation is probably not what brought you here. Understanding the machinery is what brought you here. And that is exactly where it starts.